Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my Week 6 waiver wire targets for the 2019 fantasy football season. On today's episode, we're going to be going over news around the National Football League and talking about a review of Week 5 of the fantasy football season. Then talking about the running back, wide receiver, tight end, quarterback, and defensive waiver wire targets going into Week 6 so that everyone can stock up on their lineups, because bye weeks, they're definitely coming. And that's pretty much it. So before we get into that, let me remind all of you, if you haven't yet already, click that subscribe button, join the community. Also click that bell notification button to stay up to date on my latest content, and make sure you click the like button on today's episode. All right, guys. Hey, everybody, how's it going? All right, so like I mentioned, bye weeks. For Week 6 of the fantasy football season, the Buffalo Bills, the Chicago Bears, the Oakland Raiders, and the Indianapolis Colts will all be participating in bye weeks. For those of you who have any Miami Dolphins and Lions, they will be coming off of bye weeks from this past week. So before we get into talking about waiver wire targets that are to the left of me, I want to kind of talk about Week 5 and the insanity that there was. Okay, so I know what all of you are thinking. There are many of you, and I know what you're thinking. You're thinking something of the sort where you're thinking, how did Will Fuller... No, I know. I'm kidding. You guys are all thinking, how did Josh Jacobs put Andrew so far into the grave? Because that's what I'm thinking, right? So I'm pretty sure we're all on the same, wavelength as right now. For those of you who didn't know, I wasn't too high on Josh Jacobs this week, and he ended up having a 27-point game in half PPR. Should have had a third touchdown that DeAndre Washington stole from him. But anyway, it is what it is, guys. I make mistakes. It's not my first, and it won't be my last. I regret it, sure. But that's just how fantasy football works. That's just how it is. I could come out and say, like, hey, the Bears hadn't given up a 100-yard rusher in this many games. But listen, I'm not about to do that. It is what it is. It's fantasy football. Mistakes are made. And if you lost because of it, I apologize. And that's all I can do. So that's it. All right. But anyway, speaking of Will Fuller, right? How many monsters were there this week? I mean, there's a couple things that we learned in fantasy football. Like, number one, Patrick Mahomes is human. For the second straight week in a row, a very disappointing performance from that offense. I believe, against the Lions, it wasn't that disappointing because they ended up winning and they ended up scoring more than 30 points. But in terms of Patrick Mahomes' performance, I understand the ankle's messing around with him. You don't have your left tackle. You don't have Tyreek Hill. But still, as an offense as a whole, this week against the Indianapolis Colts at home, very disappointing. And Patrick Mahomes showed he's not the Terminator. He's human. Other than that, things that I wanted to mention. Gardner Minshew needs more respect. The guy is the rookie of the year right now. Thus far this season, through the first 5 weeks, he is the rookie of the year, and there's nobody else in my mind that really stacks up to him. What he's been able to do, being thrown into this opportunity, it's absolutely incredible in my eyes. Other than that, what else did we learn? I thought the Green Bay Packers couldn't stop the run. Well, that's not the case. It's the Dallas Cowboys that can't stop the run, and they're really the pretenders, which is really interesting. But hey, the Green Bay Packers ran the ball on them for 60 minutes straight, and they could not stop them at all. Other than that, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers can't stop a soul on defense. Let Teddy Bridgewater murder them with a combination of Michael Thomas. Not really too big of a surprise there. In terms of touchdowns, there was a really interesting stat that I wanted to mention. 11 players this past week had 2 or more touchdowns. Imagine that. 6 wide receivers had 2+ touchdowns, 4 running backs had 2+ touchdowns, and 1 tight end had 2+ touchdowns. And that tight end was Darren Fells of the Houston Texans, of all players. Imagine that. But insane week. Insane. Comparatively to last week, where it was very little scoring, this was a nice juice boost up in terms of fantasy points. Hopefully you were on the right side of it. Maybe you had Aaron Jones carry your week. Maybe you had Philadelphia's defense carry your week. Maybe you were a Deshaun Watson owner. Maybe you were a Lamar Jackson owner. There are some pretty big discrepancies here in performances. But hey, all in all, pretty fun Week 5 and ready to go to Week 6. All right, so let's go and let's talk about some Week 6 waiver wire targets for the 2019 fantasy football season. Starting off with the running back position, shall we? All right, so number one. Now, you may be thinking, why is Kenyan Drake the number one suggested player in terms of picking up a running back? Let me remind you. this past week, week 5, the Miami Dolphins were on bye week. If, in fact, Kenyan Drake was dropped in your league, I wouldn't be surprised because of the fact that Kenyan Drake thus far this season has been nothing but bad. You know, the entire organization for the Dolphins has struggled heavily in terms of, you know, they just want to tank games. They just want to catch L's and get the first overall pick. That's really what they're leaning towards. But I do think that Kenyan Drake this coming week could potentially put himself in a good position to perform against the Washington Redskins. Both teams struggling to find a victory. I think the way that I've seen it as of late, it's probably going to be the Redskins winning this game because of how bad Gruden needs that win. Otherwise, he's getting fired. So, but either way, I really do think that Kenyan Drake is to be available in your league. He's not a bad pickup, especially for those of you who are going to have multiple running backs out due to bye week. So Kenyan Drake, if he's available because somebody dropped him last week because they were on a bye week, not a bad pickup. All right, moving on to number 2, Jon Hilliman. So really quick piece of information. There is a potential that Saquon Barkley could come back in week 6. Now, what it was previously diagnosed as was a high ankle sprain, and the potential of him missing 6 to 8 weeks was very likely. And now all of a sudden they're telling us that, yeah, 3 weeks is all he needs. Saquon Barkley is superhuman, and his genetics should be cryo-frozen, and he's pretty much a Captain America. Just leave him and let's get ready for World War III, because that's what he is. He's literally a Superman. He's coming back potentially this coming week. If not, Wayne Gallman did suffer a concussion. He was knocked out of the game against the Minnesota Vikings. And this coming week on Thursday Night Football, on a short week, there probably isn't going to be a Gallman present at the game participating. And chances are, I do not believe that Saquon's going to force himself back this week to play. But if he does, that's awesome. But if there is no Barkley and there is no Gallman, Jon Hilliman would be the player to pick up for that backfield for those of you who are looking for a little bit more depth at the running back position. All right, moving on. Number 3, Gus Edwards. Now, for those of you who don't know, the Cincinnati Bengals are the worst team against opposing running backs. They literally give up so many points on a weekly basis to opposing running backs. It's unbelievable. This past week, Chase Edmonds, Duke Johnson, both of them, plus 15 fantasy points. The week before that, Jalen Samuels and James Conner, both of them, plus 18 fantasy points apiece in half PPR. The week before that, Frank Gore had a monster game. The week before that, Jeff Wilson Jr., Matt Breida, and Raheem Mostert all put up 13-plus fantasy points. And in week 1, we had a 20 bomb from Chris Carson. The Cincinnati Bengals cannot stop the run. They play against the Baltimore Ravens this week, and I truly do believe this game could get out of hand. It could be a one-sided affair where the Baltimore Ravens are blowing them out. If that is the case, a guy like Gus Edwards, who has gotten some touches sprinkled throughout the first month of the season, could be in line for a pretty good 10-rush game in which he busts out a pretty good couple runs and he could be fantasy relevant. I truly think that there's a possibility. In terms of his availability, he's most likely available in your league. So if you play in a deeper league and you're in need of a running back on said week, he's not a bad option against the Bengals. All right, moving on. Reggie Bonnafon. Okay. If Christian McCaffrey is to be injured and not play this coming week, I know the severity of that injury that he sustained last week, or this technically yesterday, against the Jaguars is probably not serious. He didn't play for the last about 7 minutes of the fourth quarter, which Reggie did, and Reggie had a nice big run for a touchdown. If in fact, Christian McCaffrey is not to play, then Bonnafon is the number 1 waiver wire addition for this week, because the potential of having a starting running back for any organization is fantastic, and I'm willing to drop my number 1 waiver for that, surely. But I want to just make sure that everybody understands, there is a potential that he's probably going to play against Tampa Bay Buccaneers this week. He needs to exact some revenge after that 4th and 1 that he failed, and the chances are that he's going to play. But for those of you who are Christian McCaffrey owners, I would go ahead and I'd grab a guy like this just to ensure that if anything happens, you are covered. Just an insurance policy. So that's number 4. Moving on to number 5, Chris Thompson. Like I mentioned earlier, the Washington Redskins, they play against the Miami Dolphins. And I do believe a guy like Chris Thompson could be of very much value for this team. Also Adrian Peterson. I know Adrian Peterson has been god-awful. From a guy that was rushing for 1,000 yards last season for the Washington Redskins to what he has become now, it is truly just incredible. The level of inconsistency, like the entire team as a whole is not as good as they were last year. That's for certain, right? They were able to win games last year. but it's crazy to think that Adrian Peterson has fallen so far. But I do think a guy like Chris Thompson, Adrian Peterson, they could be of service this week for those of you who are looking to fill maybe a flex position in a PPR format because of the bye week hell that you potentially could be in. So, those are my suggestions at number 5. My last suggestion for the running back position. If in fact, Devin Singletary has missed, if I'm not mistaken, I actually want to confirm this. How many weeks in a row has he missed? 4? Yeah, I think it's 4 weeks. Let's find this. Devin Singletary has he's missed 3 weeks in a row. This week will be on bye week and probably will return on August 20th or October 20th, against Miami. If there is a possibility that someone in your league, because they need a roster spot, because he is on a bye week, someone drops him in your league. He's owned in 72% of leagues, so the chances are he's probably still owned. But if someone drops him, I would suggest picking him up. I think later on in the season, Frank Gore is not going to be the starting running back of this team. It is going to be Devin Singletary. He is going to take over the job as time progresses. So for those of you who are interested, if that guy is available, if he has been dropped anytime as of late, go pick him up. I just wanted to throw that out there because I really do think going forward could be a really big contributor in terms of fantasy. So those are my top 6 at the running back position going into week 6. Let's go ahead and let's talk about my wide receiver position. Here we go. So my top targets for the wide receiver position going into week 6. Number 1, Mohamed Sanu. Sanu's been incredible. It's kind of insane. We all know that. I'm actually just looking up some Sanu stats really quickly. Here we go. We all know that the Falcons, they love to throw the ball. They throw the ball literally like 70% of the time. Outside of giving the running backs maybe like 14, 15 rushes a game, really, they don't see much work outside of that. And really, Devontae Freeman has kind of turned into that receiving back that I was hoping he'd turn into. 2 weeks ago, a pretty good game in the receiving department. Ended up pretty much solidifying his value there as a double-digit fantasy producer. This past week, did it again in the receiving game, had a touchdown. Again, another double-digit performance, which is absolutely promising, and it's really good, especially now that they go and they play against, if I'm not mistaken, the Atlanta Falcons play against the Cardinals this coming week. How easy is that matchup? But we're talking about Mohamed Sanu. I don't know how we got off track. In the last 3 weeks in half PPR, Mohamed Sanu, 10.7, 13.6, 12.8. I mentioned him in the past. Mohamed Sanu should have already been picked up, but if he is not yet picked up by now, which he should have been, but if he is not yet, because he's only 42% owned, he's been picked up by 15% of leagues as of late. But, in terms of target counts, 6, 12, 15, caught a touchdown this past week, yardage counts, 75, 91, 42, pretty good, in an offense that has no defense and has to pass the ball consistently. They have somehow managed to have a very relevant receiving core. Yes, some weeks Calvin Ridley takes off. Some weeks Julio Jones takes off. Some weeks Mohamed Sanu will take off. And Hooper and Freeman. But all in all, I think this is an extremely valuable offense, especially going forward in terms of fantasy. And Mohamed Sanu should be picked up. All right, moving on to number 2, Jamison Crowder. So what I heard earlier today was that Sam Darnold of the New York Jets will be tested to make sure that he is cleared of mononucleosis so that he can return to the team and potentially start this week playing against the, I think it's the Cowboys. Yeah, the Cowboys at home. So if that is the case, I really do think Sam Darnold and Jamison Crowder as a duo are pretty solidified. Week 1, 17 targets, 14 receptions, 90-some-odd receiving yards. That duo is going to continue. I know that the schedule for the New York Jets is really favorable, especially for the wide receiver and the quarterback position as of late. Let me just go ahead and read it off to you guys so that for those of you who are looking to invest in perhaps a Robbie Anderson or a Chris Herndon or a Jamison Crowder, maybe a Le'Veon Bell, this might be the time to do so before the schedule arises because they have no more bye week. Bye week was week 4. They're past that. Just to kind of go over. The next 2-3 weeks are pretty difficult. They get Dallas, they get New England, then they get Jacksonville. But after that, from week 9 on, it's the home stretch of pretty much getting you to the fantasy playoffs with some pretty good performances. We have Miami. Okay, so we have the Dolphins, we have the Giants, we have the Redskins, we have the Raiders, then the Bengals, then the Dolphins again. That is a beautiful stretch of games from week 9 to week 14, getting you straight into your fantasy playoffs and potentially getting you to your championship. I really do think that Jamison Crowder is going to be the top contributor in this offense in terms of receptions or targets. So going forward, if he's not yet owned in your league, 44% owned in Yahoo leagues right now, he's a great option. Moving on, number 3, Auden Tate. Listen, I would have thought by now Adrian would be back. He is not back, and that's okay. The Bengals offense somehow managed to put up a pretty good number yesterday against the Cardinals. A lot of it coming from the second half, and majority was a comeback. Auden Tate had himself a touchdown. Tyler Boyd had himself a touchdown. The receiving core there looks fine, even without John Ross, even without AJ Green. But when you get into tougher matchups, when you have to play against the Baltimore Ravens, which aren't that great a defense, but when you have to play against tougher matchups and they get after Andy Dalton, it's going to get a lot more tougher as the weeks progress. But I do think Auden Tate, until, like I mentioned last week, until AJ Green comes back, he's just a fill-in. He's a guy that you can throw into your wide receiver 3 slot and hope that he kind of figures something out like he did this past week. And to be honest, you just wait. So for now, that's not a bad receiving option. He's my number 3. Moving on to number 4, Willie Snead. Okay, so what I heard was that Marquise Brown's ankle injury that forced him to leave the game. He did have a touchdown, and then he left the game with an ankle injury. John Harbaugh said that it was not serious. So I'm going to take his word for it. I'm going to assume it wasn't that bad. But if, in fact, Marquise Brown is out, they play against the Bengals this week. And Willie Snead seems like a pretty good option in terms of a wide receiver. Sure, they have Miles Boykin over there. They still have, their plethora of tight ends that they're going to feed. And they have the running game, which they can absolutely destroy the Bengals with, just primarily with that. But I do think that if Willie Snead, or if Marquise Brown is to miss time, Willie Snead is a pretty decent pickup as a guy that could be a nice safety blanket for Lamar Jackson. When you throw 3 interceptions in one game, you're going to come back the next week and you're going to play it a little bit safer. You're going to try to check down. You're not going to try to force the issue. And you can, probably ensure yourself Willie Snead a couple catches for some good amount of yards this coming week. All right, moving on. Number 5, Keke Coutee. All right, so the Houston Texans, holy moly. Deshaun Watson, 5 touchdowns, monster game. Will Fuller, 200-plus yards, 14 receptions, 3 receiving touchdowns. DeAndre Hopkins somehow got double-digit points, 12 points, but still it's better than nothing. Carlos Hyde, double-digit points. The tight end position, 2 touchdowns from Darren Fells. Keke Coutee, pretty good amount of yards. If Kenny Stills continues to deal with that injury, the chances are that Keke Coutee can make himself a relevant receiving option once again. This past week, Kenny Stills was out. We saw a resurgence in Keke Coutee's availability and his prominence. Hopefully, he continues to see some good targets going forward. They play against the Kansas City Chiefs in Kansas City this coming week. It's going to be a high-scoring affair between 2 of the highest-scoring, most athletic offenses in the AFC. And I think it's going to be pretty fun. I think Keke Coutee, as a wide receiver 3 this coming week, pretty good option. Moving on to my last wide receiver option. Speaking of the other side of that matchup, I know Patrick Mahomes in the last 2 weeks has not looked good, but Byron Pringle this past week somehow was the number 1 wide receiver. Sammy Watkins, no thank you. Demarcus Robinson, no thank you. Mecole Hardman, no thank you. Travis Kelce, no thank you. Byron Pringle, come. Like, how is this possible? Somebody explain this to me. Byron Pringle, might as well get a Pringle ad ASAP. Either way, I think if you're interested, if you play in a deep enough league, if Tyreek Hill isn't back, a guy like this getting so many targets, pretty ridiculous. Ending up in the end zone prior to this week has done nothing. But that's just the Kansas City offense. A lot of nothings as of late. But that's my last option at the wide receiver position. Let's go ahead and let's move on. Let's talk about tight end, shall we? All right, moving on to the tight end position for week 6. Number 1, Chris Herndon. Now, the only concern that I have with Chris Herndon revolves around head coach Adam Gase, which was quoted to have said earlier today that I'm not going to commit to a role for Chris Herndon in this offense. Like, why would you say something like that? Like, you don't even have a W yet. Like, what do you mean? Getting a player back like this should be involved in this offense, regardless. I do think that Chris Herndon is going to be of value. He has already surpassed his bye week, so going forward, if you need a bye week fill-in, potentially, this is a guy that, especially for those of you, like I mentioned last week, if you have Darren Waller and he's out this week as the Raiders are on bye. You can fill in Chris Herndon at that receiver or that tight end spot, and going forward should be pretty decent. He's a good tight end last year. He was able to produce at a pretty consistent level, so I don't mind him going forward, especially with Sam Darnold coming back. Moving on to number 2, Gerald Everett of the Rams. If in fact, which I'm expecting, Brandon Cooks is going to be in concussion protocol, could potentially miss this game because of the amount of serious concussions he has sustained in the last couple of years. Gerald Everett seemed to be their number 3 receiving option for this team outside of Cooper Kupp, Robert Woods. It was Gerald Everett. Josh Reynolds got a little bit of sprinkling here and there. So did Tyler Higbee. So did Todd Gurley. But I think Gerald Everett, made some plays in the last couple of weeks, giving me some confidence for him in tight end position this coming week playing against the 49ers. Could be a pretty good game. Overall, I think Everett, not a bad option at the tight end position considering his target count and his snap share. Moving on to number 3, James O'Shaughnessy of the Jacksonville Jaguars, consistently with Gardner Minshew is producing. In terms of this offense for the Jacksonville Jaguars, a lot better than expected. They are playing at home this week, playing against the Saints. It's a tough matchup, but I do think that if you're desperate enough for the tight end position, a guy like James O'Shaughnessy is a decent pickup for those of you in a deep league. All right, moving on to the last 2 options. Both guys that are injured. Number 4, we have Hunter Henry. Hunter Henry, his injury is not that bad. Therefore, what does that mean? Hunter Henry could be returning very soon. Another one of these superhumans with genetic, I don't even understand. Like, how is it possible that you could have a fractured patella and then 4 weeks later, people are saying you might be coming back in a week or so? I don't know how these guys do it. These NFL monsters are just unbelievable. 2019 medicine, that's all I can say. But hey, Hunter Henry could be returning soon. For those of you who have injured reserve spots on your rosters, throw him in there, keep him ready because he's a tight end that I could produce. This offense for the Los Angeles Chargers struggled heavily this Sunday against the Broncos. They need another weapon. Hunter Henry could be that option. So for those of you who are kind of like me and feeling like he could come back, not a bad option. Number 5, Vernon Davis was injured with a concussion. Probably will miss this coming week against the Dolphins. Very juicy matchup. If Jordan Reed would like to bless us with his presence this week, with Colt McCoy, he's been extremely good in the past. In the last couple of years, last season especially, with Colt McCoy, Jordan Reed has typically been the number 1 wide receiver option for the Redskins when they are paired together. Hopefully, Jordan Reed comes back. If that's not the case, then woof, and he's just not an option. But hopefully, crossing fingers, he finally wants to show up in 2019 and have himself a pretty good game against a really good matchup. I know his injuries have been pretty serious, but I'm just hoping he can make a return. All right, moving on. Let's talk about quarterbacks, shall we? My top 6 quarterbacks at the position in terms of targets this week. Number 1, Teddy Bridgewater playing against the Jaguars. If, in fact, Jalen Ramsey is not playing once again, this Jaguars defense has not shown to be much of the same. They have really struggled in the past. We saw Christian McCaffrey completely destroy them. Sure, Kyle Allen did not put forth a great performance, but Teddy Bridgewater has a better team surrounding him and will be able to produce. I don't mind him as an option this coming week. Moving on to number 2, Kirk Cousins playing against the Eagles. In terms of the pass rush, that could be an issue, but I really do think that Kirk Cousins is on a better path towards kind of passing the ball more. Hopefully, that's the case. 300 passing yards, 2 touchdowns. Sure, it was against the Giants, but I do think that the secondary for the Eagles is not that good, and I think Kirk Cousins could put himself in a pretty good position here. Sterling Shepard is back in concussion protocol. We'll probably likely miss this Thursday's game. Okay, that affects Daniel Jones, but we'll get to that in a second. Number 3, Gardner Minshew playing against the Saints. Like I mentioned before, this guy is the rookie of the year thus far. He needs more respect for those of you who are in a 2 QB league. If this guy's not picked up already, how dare you? He is a great fantasy option on a consistent basis. The dude is throwing for 2 touchdowns a game, can move with his legs, and to be honest, is in an offense that is pretty much moving. They're not winning games, but Leonard Fournette's producing, DJ Chark's producing, D.D. Westbrook's playing well, he's playing well, James O'Shaughnessy, like I just mentioned. This offense is moving in the right direction, I'll tell you that much. Moving on to number 4, Andy Dalton plays against the Baltimore Ravens. The Bengals and the Baltimore Ravens, going to be a tricky matchup, another AFC North matchup, but I do think that this Baltimore defense has not looked good. Has not looked good in a while. Thus far this season, been pretty poor against the running game, against the passing game, Andy Dalton could mess around and find himself some value. Moving on, number 5, Kyle Allen plays against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. That defense can't stop anybody. If the pass rush gets to Kyle Allen, that could be a big problem. And Ndamukong Suh, Shaq Barrett could present a pretty good pass rush there to force Kyle Allen into fumbling the ball 10 times like he did the week before against the Texans. But I do think that if he can get back in the pocket, find some confidence, let the ball go, maybe find Greg Olsen once in a game, that'd be great. But that's fine. Number 6, Daniel Jones. Like I just mentioned, Sterling Shepard's going to be out. Outside of Evan Ingram, I don't think I want to touch anybody. If Saquon's playing, sure. But outside of Evan Ingram, that's it. I don't want to touch anybody else. And those are the quarterback options. You know what? Daniel Jones can pretty much get pulled off this list because of that information coming through. All right, to the last part of this episode, shall we? Defensive waiver wire targets. Number 1, the Los Angeles Chargers playing against the Pittsburgh Steelers. With Ben Roethlisberger out, with Mason Rudolph getting knocked out, getting hit in the chin, boop, sleep. They're on their 3rd string quarterback. It's going to be pretty rough for them to try to produce. I know that the Chargers did not play well this past week at home against the Broncos, but they will be back on track to try to put together a performance. And I think against a 3rd string quarterback, undrafted free agent rookie, it's going to be a pretty easy game for them. So the Chargers defense, pretty good option. Moving on to number 2, I do like the idea of playing the Tampa Bay Buccaneers against Kyle Allen. I know I just mentioned Kyle Allen as a potential waiver wire pickup, but he's a lower option. I do think that this pass rush, it wasn't just, it was a couple weeks back, week 2, where we saw Shaq Barrett have 4 sacks against Cam Newton. I do think we could see history repeat itself once again. The Tampa Bay Buccaneers defense has been pretty decent all season long in terms of forcing turnovers and scoring defensive points. In terms of fantasy, this last week, Teddy Bridgewater torched them up. That was a good team, but the Carolina Panthers without Cam, a little bit tricky, especially if Christian McCaffrey's on a pitch count, especially because of these, they're worrying about overfeeding him. Not a bad option. Moving on to number 3, Denver Broncos. The Denver Broncos playing against the Tennessee Titans. Here's the thing. The Titans, I'm not surprised that Marcus Mariota struggled. I anticipated that because the corners and the secondary of the Buffalo Bills are not to be messed with. They are a consistent group. If, in fact, we end up seeing something of the sort where Denver Broncos forced Marcus Mariota to have to throw the ball, they looked pretty good against the run, even though they gave up. They gave up 200 yards to Leonard Fournette, and then they followed up by completely bottling up Austin Eckler and Melvin Gordon, just shutting them down easily. So this coming week, playing against Derrick Henry, could have themselves a pretty good performance at home. I don't mind that as a defense. Number 4, Tennessee Titans. On the other side of that matchup, again, Joe Flacco isn't prone to making mistakes. He definitely is capable of making a couple mistakes here and there. I do think that this defense, again, similar to the Broncos, pretty good against the run, pretty good against the pass. Overall, could end up forcing some turnovers here and there. Could have himself a pretty good game. Moving on, number 5, Washington Redskins. The Dolphins aren't a great offense. If the Washington Redskins are ever going to be relevant this season, it's probably this game. Or it's maybe the other side of that matchup. Maybe the Miami Dolphins have a good defensive week. But in terms of playing a defense against a rookie matchup, like the Jets are going to have Darnold. They're not going to be that bad. There's no Nick Folks. There's no Fitzpatrick's throwing interceptions. There's no Dwayne Haskins throwing interceptions. I'm looking at the matchups right now. Outside of the Chargers, that's the only juicy one there. But the Redskins could be a decent matchup. Like I mentioned, Sam Darnold shouldn't be that bad. But if he ends up being really bad, the Cowboys could take advantage of that. The Cowboys' pass rush has been pretty good in the last couple weeks. If they can stop the run against Le'Veon Bell, then perhaps they'll have themselves a pretty good week. That is pretty much it, ladies and gentlemen. I want to thank everybody for watching. Thank you for spending your time with me today. Quick, 30-minute episode, to the point, concise. Hopefully, a lot of these players are available in your leagues. I know last week, the waiver wire landscape, again, just wasn't filled with a lot of talent. And we're going to progressively see that as the weeks go on. It is a wasteland. Hopefully, I brought up some names that are available in your leagues for those of you who are really struggling and need some assistance. So if in fact that helps you out, I appreciate that. And hopefully, I am listening. I go down to my comment section and I do listen to what you guys are saying. A lot of you were complaining that those guys weren't available. These guys should be. If they're not, then I don't know what to do. Because to be honest, then it is what it is. You just have to deal with trading. Find somebody that is in need of a running back or a wide receiver that you have a plethora of, and start wheeling and dealing and try to have fun with that. All right. Thank you, everybody, again for watching. Until tomorrow, which will be the running back starter sit video with my top 36 rankings. I appreciate it. And hopefully tonight we'll have a pretty good Monday night game. Hopefully it's not going to be too boring in San Francisco between the Browns and the 49ers. Thank you, and I'll see you guys tomorrow. Peace.